Recorded live at Town Hall here at Hiller Measurements. This is AE Squared. I want to introduce you guys to the COO of CrowdStrike. This is Mr. Colin Black.
Afternoon.
So last week, Airbus suffered a massive data breach. You may have heard about it in the news. It addressed both Airbus and many of their key suppliers. Rolls-Royce was one of them. As it turns out, it looks like it was a nation state that did it, attacked their VPN. Sure glad that wasn't us. Well, our guest today, he's got a lot to say about cybersecurity. This is one of the most exciting companies today in cybersecurity. You hear about them in the news, you read about them, and they're really setting the trend for what cybersecurity protection looks like tomorrow. We're really excited to have Mr. Colin Black, the COO of CrowdStrike.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Good to see you.
You bet. So Colin, I got to tell you, there's a lot that I want to get to and talk to you about CrowdStrike. But before we get there, you've got a bit of an accent.
I do.
I take it you didn't grow up here in the United States?
No, it's not a natural Californian accent, even though I've been there for 19 years now. But yeah.
So where'd you grow up?
Glasgow, Scotland.
Glasgow, Scotland.
Yes, indeed.
So growing up in Glasgow, Scotland, what did you imagine you were going to be doing with yourself?
That's a great question. I originally started in electronics. I thought I'd be in electronics. Really, my uncle and my grandfather kind of inspired me. They said my grandfather was a double professor of mathematics. Oh. So he gave me a lot of logic side, but he also repaired TVs as a hobby, and as a young kid, that fascinated me. My uncle, now retired colonel, a major actually with the Royal Signal Corps. When I was, maybe 8 years old, I'd go to his house and he would have ham radios set up, and for a hobby he'd say, hey, why don't we build a radio together? And literally we would put these transistors together and, noise would come out of this thing, and, as a young kid, that was just amazing. So for me, that inspired me to go into electronics, and I thought I'd be repairing TVs and building, radios, and that was kind of, that was fun.
So from there, you went to university in Glasgow?
Yes. Yeah, I went to University of Glasgow, specialized. It was a kind of a general course, electronics and electrical engineering. That's what they offered at the time. And that was kind of one of the early courses in electronics. It was 82, 86, so everything was still Boolean logic and working out how transistors fitted together. ICs were just coming on the scene. Dating myself here, but it was all transistors at that point. That was the course offered. So we did everything from power engineering to Boolean logic and building logic boards and such like. And Glasgow University, unbeknownst to me at the time, specialized in quantum physics. Had a scanning electron microscope. They had a lot of great folks there, and I kind of fell into quantum physics there.
You fell into quantum physics?
Yes.
There's something I don't hear every day. Yeah.
Just sure there's some, Alice through the looking glass on that one, but yeah.
So you finish in double E with quantum physics. Where do you go with that? I mean, do you go into research? Do you go?
Yeah. So I went into research. When I left university, I'd been working with them for maybe a year and a half with the physics department, which is where quantum physics was at the time. During summer, I started using their scanning electron microscope and building field effect transistors.
Sure.
Quantum field effects, literally kind of growing those things and working them out. And then ended up doing my thesis on that there at university, where we kind of built 0.1 micron gate and pitch quantum field effect transistors, and this was in '86.
Yeah, that's way ahead of time.
It was challenging to grow those and build them, let alone then test and measure them. But we did that and kind of wrote my thesis on that, and they'd like me to stay on as and do my doctorateship, but being a Scotsman, I decided it was time to earn some money. And so they helped me get my first job as a kind of quantum physicist working on quantum field effect transistors.
Right. And so how long did you do that? So you went out of academia, you went...
Yep. So I went and worked with a company called Plessy Research Caswell,
Right.
which was an old World War II establishment in southern England, in the hills in the middle of nowhere. And actually very appropriate because, you know, when you're making gallium arsenide, you're using arsenic
Right.
and all sorts of interesting chemicals. But yeah, I went there for a couple of years doing quantum field effect transistors, building those, which became, you know, today's HEMTs, high electron mobility transistors you see in the front of satellite dishes today. Yeah.
So I find this fascinating because from there, I read you made a hard, shall we say, a hard right turn, right? Because you went from research.
Well, I'm European, so it's left turn.
Left turn, excuse me. I got to get that right.
Right.
So hard left turn from hard research to business development.
Yep.
Yeah, tell me that story.
Yeah, you know, my wife at the time worked for the National Health as a nurse.
Yeah.
And nurses in the UK are notoriously underpaid. Do a lot of great work, but you know, are notoriously underpaid. And I was giving a paper in Lake Lugano, really as one of the foremost kind of scientists on this piece of technology, high electron mobility transistors, and you know, I was being paid less than what she was, and my bosses had basically said to me, look, you know, you're earning, you know, you cost us this much, we're getting this much more in grants, and this is how it is. And so to me, I lost the kind of research bug at that point, and decided that if I was going to work for someone, I ultimately wanted to make some money, and I loved beautiful cars as a young boy. You know, I'd always aspired to have a V12 Ferrari.
Sure.
Just one of those things, a little kid in Scotland, those cars are beautiful. And so decided to move into something that's a little more commercial, semiconductor distribution. And it kept kind of I did a field application engineering role, which keeps one foot in engineering because I didn't want to kind of leave it all behind. I did that safety net of doing, you know, something you knew, and then becoming more commercial. So that's how I got into distribution as a field application engineer.
Do you find that interesting? I mean, you're doing hardcore research, and now you're troubleshooting guys like us that are laying out a PCB.
Yeah, it was really interesting. You know, it's the same. You know, I
different.
come back to where, you know, my grandfather. You know, his genes are very logical. I have that logical side to me, and so for me, you know, logic is very gratifying. You know, going through those logical things. That's why a COO role is very good for me, right? It's all very kind of logical in numbers, right?
Right.
But no, you know, the engineering for somebody else was still that logical problem that you were looking to solve. Rather than independent research, it was still another problem to solve. Except it was actually more interesting because it was very varied.
Right.
It was, you know, 2 or 3 different problems a day, and there were different ones each time. And so it was really interesting and very varied. So it was very interesting to me.
Interesting. Now, this is interesting as well because in that period, I read that you went from FAE all the way to the CEO?
Correct.
Of that
a small business unit.
Small business.
Yeah. It was a different group. I left that group in the UK and joined another company which was called MEMEC, MEMEC. They were a semiconductor distributor, very specialized. And at that point, I joined them as a marketing manager.
Right.
And so I went from field application engineering into marketing and kind of completed a transition from, you know, engineering and research and into marketing.
Yeah.
And at that point, I had a P&L responsibility. I learned to run a P&L account. I was responsible for hiring my own field application engineers to promote the products I had. And I could come out to Silicon Valley and try and hire new semiconductor lines that we would represent.
Right.
And I was very successful at that where others weren't, because I had an engineering background. So I was able to tell them which customers use the type of products and why. And I understood the product. And so I became quite successful in that marketing role. And from there became a CEO of one of the business units.
You made this ascension from research to business development to CEO. Most people don't make that, right? Along the way, they find themselves kind of solved. Why do you suppose you were able to I haven't heard
That's
that
a good
your
question.
family owned a business. How did you pick up the business side of this?
Well, I learned very quickly the P&L side. One of the beauties of the model that we had at Memic was that the profit and loss accounts were kind of drilled down into the organization.
Right.
And so even at the product division, you had a P&L, which would roll up to the CEO, which would roll up to the group level. And we frankly were bonused on how well did we do in our P&L. So you learn the levers of that P&L pretty quickly. And so that's how I learned P&L, the profit and loss, and how to invest wisely.
Right.
Same with the model with inventory. One of the problems that kills distribution is having too much inventory cash flow.
Yeah.
But we had a model that basically would penalize you if you had too much inventory that didn't move in 3 months.
Right.
You would get 10% of that cost of the inventory would come off your P&L. If you didn't move it for 6 months, 100% would be written off. And so you learn very quickly to balance a number of things. Inventory was one, the people you were hiring was another.
Right.
And the technology you were using. So you learned all of that quite quickly. And for me, it was just logic.
It was just
It
logic.
was just logic. It's
Even
just,
the
I'm
people
turning,
part?
yeah.
Hiring, managing, leading.
Yeah, I found that was logic too.
Really?
In finding the right people, it was became logic. But I also found I had a feel for that side of things. Yeah. Quite where that came from, I don't know. But you do have a natural kind of feel for things like that in change management, for example, right. Where the human interaction piece is just something I think I naturally have been blessed with. So I was able to hire good people. Of course, I've made my share of bad hires over time, as we all have, and you learn from those and move on. And you realize the importance of people in everything, right? The most important thing you can do is hire the best people.
Right.
After that, everything else can come. But if you don't hire the right people, it's really, really tough.
So I want to get into how you made this next transition, which is going from CEO to CIO, and that's where things get really excited, right?
That's a fun transition.
Yeah, but first, I want to share with our viewers at home or whatnot, you're probably wondering, who are we? Who's Hiller Measurements? Well, I wanted to let everyone know, Hiller Measurements, we design custom electronic test equipment, typically for mission-critical applications, aerospace and defense, 5G, power storage tests, things of that sort. So if you're concerned about test and what to do about it at your company, I'd encourage you to check us out at hillermeg.com. So,
very good.
Back to this interesting transition. Some people would say going from CEO to CIO is kind of a back step, but I think there's an interesting story here because it leads directly to where you're at CrowdStrike, which is fascinating. So
it is.
Tell us that story.
Well, I was CEO of a small business unit. This was, roughly speaking, 25 million US back in about 96, that would have been, I think. We were part of a group. And the way we were successful was that we shared back office functions, whether it was distribution centers, whether it was finance, and we had our own kind of companies that kind of plugged into that. At that point, we were Europeanizing. This was happening in the scene at that point. We were no longer just UK. It was becoming Europe at that point. And so we kind of put these companies together and changed them all into 3 global brands. And with that, we were reorganizing the environment. And my CEO, actually, the group CEO, asked me to take on global marketing for a period of time. And the reason for that was that I was able to sign distribution lines that others couldn't, primarily because I had this ability to understand the semiconductors themselves and talk to the people in the way that they would understand. But having done that for a little bit, my CEO and I were very good friends. We raced. I live relatively close to Silverstone, as did he, which is the Formula 1 track in the UK.
Still no 12-cylinder Ferrari, though?
Still no 12-cylinder Ferrari at that point. No, these were inexpensive little cars at that point. Caterham Superlight Rs, and then got into Porsche and other things. But essentially, we owned a little car between us at that point. It was our first little dabble in, and we were at the racetrack, and I used to bust his chops all the time about IT and how we were behind, and that we really needed to come up to speed because at this point, this new thing, the internet,
Yeah, Netscape
was
had
coming
just
in.
come out then, right? Yeah.
Right, and what we feared at that point as a distributor was that no longer would you require distribution, but the suppliers would come out direct to companies like yourself and sell direct, and there'd be no need for it.
Right.
And so I was pushing harder and harder until one day at the racetrack at the weekend, he'd said to me, okay, you're taking over IT. And I was kind of like, okay, maybe I pushed this one too hard. But he's probably joking. And then we got in the office on the Monday, and he said, no, you are taking over IT. And so that's how I got into IT.
You really knew nothing about IT necessarily, other than
I knew how to plug the network connection into the back of my computer at that point, you know,
Right.
and that was novel because it was all VT220 terminals and mainframes at that point.
Yeah.
But
So,
yes.
so now you're in charge of IT, and you're still the CEO.
No, at that point I'd moved on to become the CIO.
CIO.
Yeah.
So you were a CIO with
the global group at this point, and we grew that group from when I joined, so it was all within the same group of companies.
Right.
Tame Components was a group company under the holding company, which was Mimic.
Yeah.
And I became the Mimic CIO, and so all of IT strategy and delivery came from there.
So what was the aha moments along the way that when you got in that will lead us to CrowdStrike today? I have to admit there was some things that perhaps were surprising or that led you to start to see what is now cybersecurity concerns.
Yeah, you know, as you start to deal with IT and get below what you generally see as a consumer of IT, you see how difficult that is.
Yeah.
And security is one of the elements that is really quite difficult to manage. And especially, I would say, today, you know, we're very used to being able to go into the Apple Store, download your own app, put everything together. But if you want something done from IT, it takes way longer than that. Yeah. And that's because there's many more complex things behind the scenes, and IT hasn't had the tools to catch up with that. But as I took over there, we were very focused on globalization and moving towards actually a public offering. Right. At that point, and you know, some things we did well. I learned change management, and some things we didn't do well, which was like a global ERP. That was fun.
Yeah, there's no such. We're about to go through ERP ourselves, so keep us in your prayers on that.
Oh yes.
Haven't heard a good story about that yet.
ERP can be challenging for the organization. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was the first of then a number of companies that you went to, all as CIO, right?
Yeah, so I moved from Mimic into a company called Mindspeed as CIO.
Yep.
They were a spin out of Rockwell Semiconductor.
Yep.
And from there I went on to Cymer, which was another semiconductor company. Right. But they made lasers for the subfab. So when you make a semiconductor, you need a very precise wavelength of light. They produce that wavelength, that light itself, in these laser machines. But having joined the company, the CEO at the time had recognized my skills and started to do other things other than just IT. And so I moved into managing facilities and then field service and manufacturing, became VP of kind of global operations at the time, applying kind of my Scottish capabilities and negotiation, shall we say, helped along the way, and just kind of logic and looking at solutions and coming up with different approaches to them, which worked for us.
At this point, you're kind of the Scottish version of a Swiss Army knife.
Exactly.
As your skill set and what you were able to do.
And it doesn't change much today, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So then, Kratos, right?
Yes, so from there I moved on and worked with Kratos Defense. Had a wonderful time there, working with the team over there. And at this point, moving into defense contractors, security really came to the fore. Yeah. Before security had been there, but really security was first and foremost in Kratos. And there really started to get involved, worked with the local FBI, was very fortunate in doing a lot of work with them. And we did some great things together in the San Diego FBI. And even today, I hold an annual meeting with them every year where we get the CIOs together with the SIM group, which I help co-found with a few folks there. And we hold a meeting there of cybersecurity every year, and I was very fortunate to go through their Citizens Academy and work with them, which was a real great experience, especially as a non-American at the time, to understand exactly how the FBI worked, which was fascinating and kind of made me very proud, actually, and actually inspired me, along with working at Kratos, to become an American. And get my top secret clearance at that point.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
This FBI Citizens Academy, I'm not familiar. What is this, like a survey of all that the FBI does, or what?
Yeah, it's kind of.
You get a badge?
You do. You do.
Okay.
Yeah, it's the citizens' version of going through the FBI Academy in a very condensed format. So you learn a number of skills and exercises through working with the FBI. So it was a really interesting time. But from them, we focus very much on cybersecurity.
Right.
But I can certainly tell you, when you've got a tool like EDR, you have visibility.
For our viewers, EDR is
endpoint detect and response.
Detect and response.
So it allows you to see and detect things going on an endpoint and be able to respond to them within the tool. And it's kind of like being blind and then you can see.
Yeah.
So you do see things happening. You are able to prevent them. You are able to, step up and take action against things that are going on. Or the tool, in fact, itself now, because that would be 6 years ago. 4 years ago, I've been here, and I think 6 years ago I bought the tool, and the company's 8 years old. So now the tool is very proactive and stops a lot of things by itself, which is great.
So, customer for 2 years, then Kurtz comes calling, and you come to CrowdStrike.
Yeah.
And you joined immediately as a COO, or are you?
No, I joined as CIO again.
As CIO, okay.
Yep. George had put together a wonderful management team. He was looking for a CIO to come on. At the point, the company was about 200 people at that point. And was looking for a CIO to come on and really up-level the technology and the infrastructure behind and build it for the future. George is all about let's do something once and do it right, rather than have to change the wheels all the time.
That had to be the most intense CIO job ever. It dawns on me, if I was the CIO of a cybersecurity company. Yeah.
So doing security at the cybersecurity company is a very intense thing, there's no question. There's a lot of focus on, but the great thing is that there are so many people inside the company that know about cybersecurity that there's no shortage of help.
Yeah, yeah, but boy, talking about having a target.
Yes, yeah, we have a big target on our back. But it's something we've been aware of from day one. We work particularly hard on, day in and day out.
Right.
We have a lot of visibility internally and externally to what's going on, and highly mature.
So CrowdStrike is a U.S.-based company, yeah? But you sell internationally?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So walk us through a little bit, because there's a lot of excitement and attention. I saw your CEO with Kramer recently on TV and whatnot, but talk to us a little bit about the Falcon, right? Falcon's the product? What is it that is fundamentally different at CrowdStrike versus your competitor?
There's a couple of things, quite frankly. The first is that the product started 8 years ago now as a cloud-based product.
Yeah.
So it's cloud native. It was built in the cloud for the cloud. A lot of the competing products out there were actually not. They were built as on-premise, and they're trying to port them to the cloud. Now they say they're in the cloud, but really all they did was move their servers into the cloud.
Right.
It really is a very, very different thing to be cloud native from a scalability perspective. So that's number one.
In fact, there is no on-premise.
We don't sell anything on-premise.
There's nothing on, okay.
No, we don't. The other thing is we have a very small single sensor that goes on an endpoint. An endpoint can be an iPad, a mobile device of some sort, a server, a computer, even Internet of Things.
Right.
And so this very small, lightweight sensor, about 20 meg, which compared to typical even AV are around 200, so it's about 10% of the size, has very little impact on the computer or whatever that endpoint is. And then all the telemetry from that machine goes to the cloud.
Right.
So we don't send files. We might say somebody opened a file, and we can see what processes spawned other processes. But there's no information about what was going on sent to the cloud. For example, we don't send files or PowerPoint or anything like that.
So this is where the cloud native differentiation starts to really become obvious, right? Because you're from the get-go.
Scalability.
Yeah, scalability, but also from day one, you were designing for this massive big data set that you could then leverage, right?
Absolutely. And so all of that data from all of these endpoints are streaming every second to the cloud. Right. And we are ingesting that and essentially processing that and bringing it in for the customer to be able to see in our user interface, which lets them see attacks. And what's very different about traditional approaches is antivirus tends to look for signatures.
Yeah.
Those signatures, you can easily change a piece of code that would change the signature and AV wouldn't pick it up. It's always rearward looking.
Right.
Something
You're
has to
looking
be
at the
out
license plate
there.
of the getaway car.
Exactly. Something has to happen first before you can create a signature, right?
Right.
The virus has to be out there. Our approach is, has machine learning and also artificial intelligence in it, but we also have indicators of attack.
Right.
And by indicators of attack, we're looking about the elements that go on in any particular attack, which are common. And so you can change how you do that attack, but these common things still happen and we pick it up. So you don't have to
anticipate the attack.
You essentially anticipate that style of attack through these indicators of attack, and you're not having to continually look backwards. You're actually looking forward and trying to catch what's happening at that time. And so those are fundamentally very different to the traditional approach. And then once you have that data in the cloud, we're then able to help customers solve other problems. So not only are we doing that EDR element, we now do AV, for example. They're traditional, or I should say machine learning based antivirus. We also have products that do patch configuration control. And things like hygiene product that we have is interesting to a lot of customers, where you can see what software is on there, who last logged into our product, where the machines are. And to roll these out, these different products would traditionally take maybe a year, maybe 6 months, maybe 18 months, depending on the size of your enterprise. And for us, it's just a key unlock in the cloud.
This is like an upgrade to an iOS.
No more sensor goes on, nothing needs to happen bar an unlocking of the user interface. And so with one single sensor, you can gain more and more functionality and remove sensors. And those interaction between sensors cause you a lot of issues. And so removing sensors has been something CIOs have wanted to do for a while. So this really is a fulfillment of a strategy that CIOs have been looking for a while. What's also very different about us is we have this data lake of information, and we also want to solve other customer problems, which are maybe orthogonal to what we have. So we actually created the CrowdStrike store, where we're working with other vendors that allow them to access that endpoint data and create the product there and be able to unlock it straight away.
So there's like an API for other developers to...
Exactly. And so you're able to access the existing data. For us, for example, we are very centered on a machine, right? What's happening on an endpoint. Insider threat, you really want to be centered around an individual. And so we actually have a partner, TrueFort, that allows that insider threat where they can take the data that we have and center it using their application and deliver different functionality. And again, this is not another sensor that needs to be loaded. It's not 18 months. All of that information and work's done, and it's seamless. You can actually start it off from our app store.
As fascinating as all that is that's focused on the machine or the person, I'm assuming this isn't something you can speak much about, but it sounds as though with that approach, you also get a fairly clear vision looking back as far as whether this is a nation state or a rogue or sources of nefarious activity. you become quite a roadmap to finding that.
Yeah, we have a product which essentially indexes all the malware and all the samples that we have out there. So like a Google search, you can put in information that returns that instantly.
Right.
We have a product where you can put in snippets of code, and it will return where that code has been used and who has that, for example. We also have an Intel department that is working constantly to build that intelligence, so we understand exactly who's doing what. And I would say that a lot of, like anyone else, people like to reuse their work.
Right.
And so it's no different in the cyber world. People will reuse pieces of code that was very successful.
And that's just like a fingerprint that you could, that's an easy pattern to recognize.
Exactly the point.
Let me ask instead, kind of turning towards our industry, and ask, in the beginning of 2018, across in the US, any company that's doing business with the government, especially in DoD, there was an entire new set of defense FARs and then these NIST guidelines for cybersecurity that really spoke to a template, if you will, at the enterprise level of how we're supposed to manage our business. And the implication was that if you didn't step up to the plate, so to speak, you weren't supposed to be able to do business with DoD. It was ironic to us, though, that how fast those mandates came down, but how subtly they were communicated. And I know to this day that there's a number of companies that are still trying to grope their way to be compliant without necessarily understanding whether they're secure, I think is a good way to put it.
Right.
What does CrowdStrike do or offer to a company that may be, a $20 million company or a $100 or a $1 billion company that wants to do business with the government but is not really sure how to get into compliance or the expense of that, so that we're both secure and checking the box as far as meeting the guidelines the government has put out?
So there are some things we do and some things we don't do there.
Okay.
So for example, let's start with what we don't do.
Okay.
We don't implement those type of frameworks like PCI or HIPAA.
Right.
We can certainly point you in the direction of folks and help you with that. But what we do is that there's pieces of NIST, for example, that our products do comply with. And using our product helps you be compliant in that manner. But it's a large framework, kind of like anything. If you look at HIPAA or whether it's PCI or other frameworks that are out there, our product plays a piece in that. And I think what people struggle with in this arena is what's my risk tolerance, and how much do I want to spend on this and my risk tolerance, and how much do I implement here? It's always a difficult balancing act.
It's hard to put a price on that, right?
It's very hard to put a price on.
If you had one ransomware attack, or like what Airbus went through, how do you put a price on the cost of that to a business? I mean,
yes, it's a lot more than the headline cost.
Yes.
Not only is it cost them a lot internally, but there's the loss of effort, there's the reputational hit. And unfortunately, it's what we see all too often, is that people are unwilling to invest in preventative technologies until there's a problem, and then it's a much bigger problem to solve and a much more expensive one. But fortunately, cybersecurity has been in the news now for 5+ years. It's become, a headline, and people are really starting to understand some of the depth of the issues. And so I think people are becoming much more aware of the risk that's there, and therefore what they need to spend. And a lot of IT budget now is primarily driven by cybersecurity.
It's almost as though the cybersecurity business is becoming like life insurance. It's not a question mark, it's a requirement.
And we do work with insurance people.
Sure.
For example.
Sure.
And if in their framework, if you use CrowdStrike, you can actually get a reduction in your cybersecurity insurance. And so we've been working with people like that to show the benefit. There's one particular company that has, their telematics program.
Yeah.
They're able to look at your stance and say how much they'll reduce your premium by if you use CrowdStrike. So we're used as a kind of an ability to see where they are and what's happening, and therefore here's a reduction in premiums. It's kind of like there's an insurance, I think, that's out there, an auto insurance, which checks how you drive, and in reporting how that drives, you get lower insurance premiums. Well, these are now starting to come into play in cybersecurity because cyber is so expensive. And there is one of these companies now that are already doing that.
Colin, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on our stage.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much for the time, and I hope we get to learn a lot more about CrowdStrike in the days ahead. So thank you for coming. You bet. Thanks for checking out this episode of AE Squared. AE Squared is a Hiller Town Hall production. Copyright 2019. Video by Anthony Longoria. And audio by Mark Skura. Music by Brian Patterson. Want tickets to a future taping? Well, stop on by at hillermej.com/townhall. Coming up on future episodes of AE Squared, Paul Dillon, co-founder and president of Zydus, fascinating semiconductor company. Tammy Newcomb, she's the new CEO at Tektronix. And Greg Gill, CEO of SRO Motorsports.